To get no, this isn't going to get taped. This is just a pre-announcement. So because of this, we ask you to, once you've eaten, if you would clear your dishes, but enjoy your food. I mean, we won't start for another 5 or 10 minutes. But once you have, please clear your dishes, because I'm told that both eating and empty plates are not telegenic. So we want you all to be seen on national television, but not with chopsticks in your mouth. So thank you. You can keep your drinks, yeah.
That's so cute. I like that.
So we'll get started in a couple of minutes.
Okay,
Just
good, good,
their food. Oh, thanks.
Are you teaching this year?
Yeah. I was on leave last year,
Ah.
so I'm back. A little rusty, but it's good. It's good. I'm doing a lecture on immigration history, and I kind of alternate. We're supposed to do one lecture a year, so.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of alternate between immigration history and Asian American history.
Oh, okay.
Where I do something.
How is the interest in Asian American stuff on campus?
I don't think it's that different than when you were there.
Really?
There's always mostly Asian American students. A few non-Asians, but not that many. Which is interesting because in Chicago, I always had like half the students were non-Asian.
Ah.
So I'm not sure why they don't do it
Chicago
here.
is a different place.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
because it's so overtly intellectual.
Right, exactly. So if it's odd to you, then you could have a curiosity about it. Right? Where at Columbia, they're more like pre-professionals and they're more strategic.
Yeah,
I don't know.
right.
Yeah. And there's a kind of a core of students around the ethnic studies program who are the activists who are really interested, and they're great. Like one of them I had in my head of my immigration class a couple years ago, and this year I'm doing the senior thesis this year, so she's in my thesis section.
And doing something interesting.
Yeah, and she's also a poli-sci, she's a double history poli-sci major, so she wants to write about the campaign finance debacle in 96?
John, what's his name?
Yeah.
Lingxi was involved in it.
But I told her, I said, she's interested in Asians and Chinese and party affiliation. I said, you would be actually, and people have written about that, right?
Yeah.
I said, why don't you write something that's like, about the whole seduction and romance between Chinese Americans and the Clinton Democratic Party. How they all wooed them in the first place. We don't really have a history of how that happened.
That's
right?
interesting. That would be interesting.
Yeah, that's more interesting. When the campaign finance, we already know about that, how they kicked everybody out.
That's a little sexier, huh?
Yeah, so we can end with that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
right.
but anyway.
There's still lots of people around who could talk about that. The Chinese American Democrats, Francie Youngberg. I don't know if you know the players.
Could I put her in touch with you? Could I put her in touch with you for possible sources? Because maybe if she knew where to go. I said, you could go talk to OCA and talk to. Yeah.
And this would be an interesting place for her to, make a sojourn to periodically and interview people. There's so many people who are still here.
That's actually really good to know. I'm going to just keep pushing. I'm going to say, you should end with a, that's like the tragic ending, right? But you should do the whole, you should have an arc where, because to me, the whole seduction,
how did it get started?
How did it get started?
Committee of 100? No. Because there was a real strategic element, to that.
Yeah,
and
right. People thought, how can we get influence? How can we have access? Right.
Using the Jews as a model, all kinds of stuff. Interesting stuff going on. Okay.
And,
no, I'm happy to help.
Okay, great. Her name is Amy Wong.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Are you getting grad students?
Yeah. I get 1 or 2 a year.
Yeah.
So I don't want too many.
Yeah, right.
I love working with them, but but to really do it, you have to not have too many.
Yeah.
So I'm not into. Hi, Alice.
Great to see you. Wonderful. We'll do an air
We'll
kiss.
kiss later.
Yeah, this is good. So great time.
Yeah.
I'll go.
Get this.
start in just a minute, but just one more quick announcement. The program that's going to be broadcast is 60 minutes, so we've planned the program to last for 60 minutes. But so after 60 minutes, I'm going to say thank you very much, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't mean the real program, that doesn't mean we're going to stop. The Q&A will be in Q&A by that time. And Q&A can go on for another half an hour or so, but I have to say that so just pretend that we're really stopping, but then continue to ask questions. Applaud at that point, but then ask questions, right. So we'll start in just a minute. I'm waiting to get a signal that it's okay to start. Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Sonia Michelle, and I'm Director of United States Studies here at the Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion of an important new book called The Lucky Ones, One Family in the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America by author Mei Nai. We're very privileged to have Mei Nai with us today to discuss her book, and we're also going to be hearing from Franklin Odo, and I'll introduce both of them to you in a minute. But before doing that, let me just say a word about the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center was established in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, and its mission is to bring together academics and scholars on the one hand and policymakers on the other, on the assumption that a democratic dialogue, as our director Lee Hamilton likes to call it, a democratic dialogue between scholars and policymakers will make for better policy. And so we organize a number of different events and programs throughout the year to bring scholars and policymakers together. And today we're going to hear from two scholars whose work very much has to do with the development of policy in the United States, in particular policy around the question of immigration. We are as I said, we're very fortunate to have with us the author of The Lucky Ones, Mei Nai, who's a legal and political historian interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 1998 and taught at the University of Chicago before returning to Columbia to join the history faculty there. She's the author of a very important book in the history of immigration, in the United States, called Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and the Making of Modern America, which was published by Princeton in 2005 and which was awarded the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians, among other recognitions. Professor Nai has also written on immigration history and policy for a number of newspapers, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Nation, and the Boston Review. She's held fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, New York University Law School, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the John Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Before becoming a historian, Mei Nai was a labor union organizer and an educator in New York City, working for District 65 of the UAW and the Consortium for Worker Education. So she comes to her subject with long experience working with immigrants and with working class people and around the issue of working class organization. As commentator on the book, we're especially privileged to have with us Franklin Odo, who's a Japanese-American author, scholar, activist, and historian. He's taught at more than 8 academic institutions, including UCLA, Princeton, and Columbia, and he was director of the Ethnic Studies program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Dr. Odo is truly a pioneering figure, not only in academia, but also here in Washington. He founded and then directed until his retirement the Asian Pacific American program at the Smithsonian Institution. And that pioneering program has really been very important in bringing Asian Pacific history to the forefront and to public attention. During his tenure at the Smithsonian, he authored, edited, and co-edited numerous publications in Asian American history, including the landmark anthology Roots and Asian American Reader, as well as his most recent book, No Sword to Bury, Japanese Americans in Hawaii During World War II. Currently, Dr. Odo is working on a book chronicling Hawaiian plantation songs, and we hope to have a discussion or perhaps an audition of that book when it's published next year. Dr. Odo has promised me he'll let me know. Dr. Odo earned his MA in East Asian Regional Studies from Harvard and his PhD in Japanese history from Princeton. So our format will be as follows. Professor Nye will discuss her book. She'll present the book and discuss it for about half an hour. Then we'll turn to Dr. Odo for some comments, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. Once again, welcome to all of you. We're very pleased to have you with us for this very important occasion. Please join me in welcoming May Nye.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for inviting me back to the Wilson Center. This is a wonderful venue. We had a conference on immigration policy here last fall, which was a great success. So it's really my pleasure to be back, and I'm very grateful. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to the book, show some images, and then I don't think I'll take a whole half hour, but we'll see how it goes. So The Lucky Ones is a biography of 3 generations of a Chinese-American family from the west coast of the United States. Their name was Tape, which is not a Chinese name. Their Chinese name was Zhou or Ju in Cantonese, but they took the name Tape. And the book covers a period from the 1860s all the way to World War II. I came across this family, or I came across the idea to write a book about the family about 10 years ago when I was researching my first book about illegal immigration. I was down here in College Park in the archives looking at records of the Department of Labor. And it was one of those things where you find something that you didn't know you were looking for. I came across a document written in 1914 about Chinese who worked as interpreters for the Immigration Bureau. And a name jumped off the page at me, Frank Tape. Now, I knew that Tape was not a Chinese name, and I knew the name from a civil rights case from 1885 in California, Tape v. Hurley. And that's a little-known case in Chinese-American civil rights history, but it was one of the first cases brought in California, and it had to do with the exclusion of Chinese children from the public schools. And the suit was brought by Mamie Tape, who's the little girl in the center of that photograph, who was denied entrance to Spring Valley School in San Francisco on grounds that she was Chinese. And she won the case. The court said that the language of the law was plain, that all children between certain ages had the access to public education in California. But it wasn't a complete victory either, because San Francisco School Board was so vehement about not having Chinese in its schools that it took the occasion to start a segregated school for Chinese children. So that was the origins of the Chinese segregated school. So I thought, well, was Frank Tape, the one I found in this document, related to this little girl? That's easy enough to find out. If you're a historian, you know, you go to the census manuscripts. And there he was. He was the little brother of Mamie Tape, and there he is standing next to her. And then as I went through the census records, I started looking to see what else I could find. I saw that when Mamie grew up, she married an interpreter who also worked for the Immigration Service. And they had a younger sister, Emily, who was sitting here on her father's lap. And Emily married the interpreter who worked for the Hall of Justice in San Francisco, the city's criminal court. And the father, Joseph, was an occasional interpreter for the imperial consul in San Francisco, but he also built a fortune in businesses that had to do with arriving immigrants into San Francisco. He was the passenger agent for the Southern Pacific Railroad and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. He was a bonds broker. He sold bonds to Chinese who needed bonding to land for temporary presence in the United States, including the crewmen of ships coming into port. And he had the monopoly on hauling baggage from the docks to Chinatown for arriving immigrants. So I feel in some ways I was the lucky one that I found in this family a fascinating family history, but also as I worked on it, I found a kind of analysis about the origins of the Chinese-American middle class in this group that I called the interpreter class, people who are brokers, that we hadn't really thought about before. But in the era of exclusion, when really all doors to mainstream American society were closed to Chinese, totally closed, these people found the one door that could open to them, which was a job with an American institution or business, the police, the courts, the steamship companies, the railroad companies, the banks, those institutions that needed to engage with the immigrants but needed somebody to facilitate or to broker those transactions. I should also mention labor contractors. Frank grew up to do some labor contracting himself, bringing Chinese workers up to the Alaskan fish canneries. So in brokering, I found a really interesting phenomenon because it was the one way that Chinese in the 19th century had access to American institutions and hence access to a kind of middle-class life that was different from the kind that people had in Chinatown. Right? I mean, there were middle-class people in Chinatown, people with wealth, merchants, and whatnot, but their lives were within the ethnic enclave. And here I found people who had a foot in each world. So I just want to show you a little bit about how unusual this family was. But as I said, although they were unusual, they were not unique. There were other people like them who played similar roles. The mother of the family, Mary Tape, sitting on the right there, she was raised actually as a rescued slave girl, so-called slave girl in San Francisco in 1868, and she actually never had a Chinese name. Her name was Mary McGlattery because she was named after the matron who raised her in that home. Here is Mary with Mamie and Frank in the early 1890s, and you can see by their dress and their manner how acculturated they are even at this early date. The family moved to Berkeley in the mid-1890s, in part because San Francisco Chinatown was such a racist environment, and I think they tired of sending their children to the segregated school, and Berkeley did not segregate its schools, and also you could buy property in Berkeley. Frank goes on to have a career in the Immigration Service, and he spends quite a few years in Seattle as the district interpreter. And as you can see, he wore his wealth and status quite conspicuously. This is a Kissel car. The modern-day equivalent would probably be a Hummer. And Frank's flashy lifestyle, he also had a diamond pinky ring and a white wife. His lifestyle engendered a lot of suspicion and resentment among his peers and superiors who came to believe that his lifestyle was supported by graft. And he stood trial in Seattle on criminal charges and was eventually acquitted, although it was only after the murder of a witness in Chinatown. But you can see here how modern they were. This is on the left, Gertrude, the youngest Tape child, with her husband and another couple. And here again on Pacific Grove. After Frank was acquitted from his trial, he left Seattle and returned to the Bay Area and reinvented himself as a respectable middle-class citizen. He takes over his father's bonding and ticket agency, and he married a young woman named Ruby Tape, who was 20 years his junior. Ruby came from a prominent family in Marysville, California, a small town north of Sacramento. She was a beautiful young woman. She probably could have had any Chinese boy she wanted. So the fact that she wanted Frank, who was 20 years older, smoked cigars, kind of paunchy, it indicates, the extent to which she herself desired social status and wealth. The Tapes owned hunting and fishing properties up in Mendocino County, and they spent a lot of time there. Ruby, on the right, preferred to fish, but she also shot game. I think that's a turkey that she's got there. And here they are, Frank and Ruby, with the parents, Joseph and Mary. Joseph has 2 birds in one hand and a shotgun, and Frank has another gun and a cigar. And so they would take these outings together with the parents, and the women would go collect wildflowers, and the men would hunt. Here are Frank and Ruby in the late 30s at the Treasure Island at the World's Fair in San Francisco.
Ruby actually left Frank in the 30s, and then in World War II, she joined the Women's Army Corps. She was quite phenomenal. She was 44 years old when she joined the Army, which was just shy of the cutoff age, which was 45. And she was promoted to technical sergeant, and she worked at Camp Ritchie in Maryland, which was a training site for military intelligence. And then she wrangled a position in MacArthur's occupation staff in Japan before she came back to the United States. So I just want to take a couple more minutes to talk to you a little bit about brokering and as something that we haven't thought much about in Chinese American history or immigration history even. But brokering and interpreting have long been strategies for advancement, not just for Chinese, but for other immigrant groups as well. New arrivals, regardless of whence they come, China, Ireland, Italy, Russia, Mexico, turn to ethnic social networks, especially organizations based on native place and kinship ties, to help them find housing, jobs, venues for recreation. But immigrants also need a special kind of assistance when they engage with institutions of the host society, employers, transportation companies, immigration authorities, the police. Every group has had its brokers who facilitate exchange between two parties who could otherwise not communicate or do business with each other. Padrones, ward bosses, notaries, coyotes. Brokering works by controlling access to a desired good, jobs, baggage handling, immigration papers, real estate, stocks. We all know of brokers. Immigrant brokers bridge a divide between social groups by trading on their knowledge of each other's language, culture, and needs. The more they monopolize knowledge and resources, the more powerful they are. If brokers help both immigrants and mainstream institutions, and they also help themselves by charging fees and commissions, and at times by cheating and extorting money from one or another party in the exchange. Because of their unusual linguistic skills and social positions, they are often the first of their ethnic group to achieve the American dream. They are the lucky ones. Eventually, though, as immigrants become settled and learn English, especially their children, they no longer need the brokers. Immigrant brokering has been, for the most part, a first-generation phenomenon. But in cases where legal barriers and racial discrimination persist, as in the case of the Chinese, brokers and interpreters held a greater measure of power over a longer period of time than did most of their European counterparts. The Chinese exclusion laws structured the path of the first Chinese American middle-class families. Although exclusion made the immigrants dependent on the brokers sustaining their livelihoods, exclusion also prevented the brokers from achieving full inclusion in American society. So hence we have the paradoxical relationship where the brokers both protest exclusion but also profit from it. One of the things I think is a takeaway of my book is that the experience of the tapes and other people like them offer us a different interpretation of Chinese American history and immigrant history in general. You know, our conventional wisdom is that exclusion and inclusion are successive phases in a path towards assimilation, right? We came, we were oppressed, we struggled hard, we studied hard, and over time we overcame the obstacles to our inclusion. But the broker's story suggests that exclusion and inclusion are not necessarily successive phases in a linear path, but sometimes are concurrent and intertwined, even if they seem to be opposite vectors in the immigrant experience. The most successful brokers were those who were canny entrepreneurs, who knew how to exploit opportunities created by the cracks in the edifice of exclusion, people who dared to break the rules. And there were many ways to break the rules. For members of racial minority groups in the 19th and early 20th centuries, merely living according to white middle-class norms could excite resentment among Euro-Americans. Protesting racial discrimination was another sign that one was uppity, not cognizant of one's place in the racial order. Taking advantage of one's own people violated the code of ethnic solidarity. And breaking the law, whether smuggling contraband, grafting, or trading in vice, was not an uncommon way to get ahead when legitimate means of accumulation were limited. Not all the brokers were crooked, certainly not, but they were all driven by relentless ambition for prosperity and recognition. And in this way, the brokers were quintessentially American. Okay,
Great,
thank you.
Thank you, May.
Okay, we'll just leave it there. I like that picture. We'll leave it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Sonia. And thank you, May, for this great book. This is an important and well-written book about a family whose name and notoriety are probably well known to scholars of Asian American history, but not to very many more people because of the Tape v. Hurley case in the 1880s. With this book, The Lucky Ones, One Family, and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, May Nai becomes the Asian American scholarly equivalent to former President Richard Nixon.
That's a surprise.
Well, let me explore this, because it may be a surprise. Nixon's visit, you may remember, in 1972 ended a couple of decades since the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and the Korean War in 1950-53, that the two nations could really embark on a path towards peaceful reconciliation. Professor Nai's work now makes it officially permissible for inheritors of the ethnic studies, Asian American studies wars of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to call a truce and seriously explore the roots of the Asian American, Chinese American middle class. This ends 4 decades of nearly unabashed support of labor, working class social history of Chinese Americans and announces a much more broadly multi-class consideration of Asian American studies. Now, I'm not saying that the two events are equal in importance. Clearly, Professor Nai's work will become crucial in future consideration of America's key turning points, while Nixon's trip to China will become a footnote. So, more seriously, since the field of Asian American studies was conceived in race, ethnic conflict, and working class advocacy, the vast majority of scholarly output has focused on those perspectives. At the same time, it has been made abundantly clear that, especially for Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, the existence of a vibrant middle class and now wealthy professionals and business folks, including people on the president's cabinet and so on, cannot be ignored. Indeed, that fact, plus the success of their progeny in the battlegrounds of college admissions, especially, makes the model minority assertion difficult to eradicate, try as we might. The rise and existence of this Asian American middle class is a constant thorn in the side of advocates of affirmative action, which includes Asian Pacific Americans, and we need constantly to point to the existence of the many Chinese working class or undocumenteds or the Southeast Asians who have been mired in difficult straits for now several generations. For Nixon, rock-solid conservative and hawkish credentials made the trip to China politically and popularly manageable. Richard Nixon and his cohorts campaigned, after all, in 1968 on a massive law and order platform which unequivocally condemned the anti-war and civil rights, human rights protests and actions then taking place. Hence, his ideological and political background provided him enormous public relations cover when he brokered that rapprochement with Communist China. Similarly, Professor Nai's impeccable credentials as a progressive labor organizer since the early days of the Asian American movement inoculates her from allegations that she might be resurrecting older notions of model minority myth-making. And much to her credit, she does not, in fact, indulge in hand-wringing guilt-tripping as she tells the stories of the Tape families. This is a fairly straightforward tale of one set of cultural brokers who found a niche which ensured some status and financial well-being. So I think it might be interesting for Professor Nai to tell us a bit about the historiography of Chinese Americans when she was considering this project and whether she had any concerns about where the book might lead. As you've heard, Professor Nai is based in the history department of Columbia University. I remember wondering with some awe, in fact, when May left labor organizing to go to graduate school, I was a visiting prof at Columbia in the history department when she was working on her dissertation, and I admired her very much for taking that plunge. And indeed, her first book, Impossible Subjects, became an extraordinarily fine treatment of America's tortured history dealing with immigration, especially what we considered to be illegal immigration. That work inspired pretty much unanimous scholarly praise for its intelligent framework and its meticulous research. This one, The Lucky Ones, will almost certainly garner a more general reading public, as surely intended, but may face some questions from her academic peers. The New York Times review from last Sunday fleetingly referred to a slight sense of discomfort at the strategy deployed by Professor Nye to insert historical conjecture where the data did not exist for her to cite. I did notice this and wondered about the practice. For example, in describing the Tape family's move to the outskirts of Chinatown in 1890, she writes, Mary Tape, Mary likely continued to refuse to live in the central Chinese quarter. This strategy, unquote, this strategy allows her to then describe that Chinese quarter, which was, quote, jam-packed with tenements, lodging houses, stores, temples, and restaurants, cigar, shoe, and clothing factories, fishmongers and butcher shops, gambling halls, brothels, and theaters. Similarly, Nye writes that the Tapes moved away from proximity to Chinatown in 1893 or 94 after a neighborhood protest over the expansion and siting of the segregated Chinese primary school to Powell Street, where white property owners vehemently opposed the intrusion. The author then wonders, quote, perhaps it was this ugly incident that prompted the Tapes to leave San Francisco's Chinatown, or maybe it was simply the accumulation of racist incidents, large and small, that continued to dog the Chinese of San Francisco, unquote. No one, I think, should react to the author's insistence on providing historical context. It was critical for any work like this. But I think there is some unease about using a writerly technique to link the Tapes so directly to the historical context. Now, I don't know that our academic colleagues will agree with Carolyn C., whose review is in this morning's Washington Post. C., whose daughter is best-selling writer Lisa C., who has written extensively on Chinese Americans and China, traces her ancestry back to Los Angeles Chinese immigrants, and whose own family might well have provided a different kind of template for the lucky ones, as readily as did the Tape family. C. is concerned that Professor Nye leaves out a lot, including the horrors of Angel Island. And so her review damns with faint praise. Quote, of course, this is an interesting and informative book, but except for a few lines about depression, there's no suffering here at all. The early Tapes seem hardly to have been human, which of course is what the whites thought all along. But this criticism points to the new direction of inquiry Nye wishes to explore, the emergence and evolution of a middle class. And for upwardly mobile Chinese immigrants or any other immigrants, depression, failed marriages, undergoing or watching family members undergo arrest and trial, or even perhaps the sense of guilt over profiting from exploiting their own countrymen, might have been evidence of considerable suffering. I would add that Nye's book is precisely not another compendium of the horrors, and there were many, faced by Chinese Americans. So it seems that Carolyn C. might have wished that Nye write another, different book.
A novel.
A novel, perhaps. We can accept readily Nye's assertion that studying the immigrant cultural brokers helps us understand the origins and evolution of the Chinese American middle class. What about her more expansive claim that the story of the Tapes and her analysis, quote, offer an alternative interpretation of Chinese American history, and indeed the history of all immigrant groups in the United States? And here, it's interesting because you read from a section which I wanted to read, but I'm going to do it again because just in case some of you weren't paying adequate attention, and there's a quiz at the end of this, so this is a part you may want to remember. She argues that while conventional wisdom sees exclusion and inclusion to be successive phases in a linear evolution to the American dream, The story of the Tape family shows us that they are sometimes, quote, concurrent and dynamically intertwined, unquote. What I think is an important insight, she insists that the more successful immigrant brokers were smart enough to know the weaknesses of the exclusionary racist system and were daring enough to break the rules, and that every immigrant group did this. So, quote, smuggling contraband, graft, trading in vice were and are then what she calls, quote, quintessentially American, unquote. Every group then, not just the Italians, had its own mafia. Every group, not just the Chinese, had its own snakeheads. Just this realization alone should penetrate our society widely and deeply. I'm not an immigration historian, but do wonder about the fact that snakeheads still exist in the Chinese American community, but not, for example, in the Japanese American one. And I wonder about the Russian community, for example, and wonder what kinds of brokers there are there. Or what I'm told is a substantial Asian Indian undocumented community in the United States. The Lucky Ones presents us with many fascinating questions crucial to our society. For this, we thank Menai. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both this wonderful presentation of the book and these penetrating and suggestive comments. We now can open the floor to questions. Please raise your hand and I'll recognize you, and wait for the mic before speaking, and please identify yourself over here.
I'm Helen Rafel. I worked in China for 5 years. 我会说普通话一点点. I wonder if you would expand on the meaning of brokering during this period when the Chinese Exclusion Act was the legal basis for immigration. Because somehow, although I haven't read your book yet, you gave me the impression that this family, parts of it, were acting as brokers to allow Chinese to immigrate. You talked about immigration. So on what grounds could they have talked about immigration when the Chinese Exclusion Act was in force?
Right, thank you. That's a great question. The Exclusion Act did not actually end all entries of Chinese into the country. That was its goal, but in fact the Exclusion Act exempted certain people from its force. So there were so-called exempt classes, which were mostly merchants, but also foreign students, ministers, certain people who are traders. And the Exclusion Act also did not prevent Chinese who were already resident in the United States at the time of its passage from leaving and coming back, at least theoretically. So because there were exemptions in the law, and the main class explicitly excluded being laborers, there was an elaborate system of interrogation when people arrived, because if you arrived and said you were a laborer, you weren't let in. But if you arrived and said you were a merchant, you could come in. So there was a lot of suspicion, and there actually was a practice of people coming with fake papers, also claiming to be native-born citizens who had gone back as a child and now were coming back as an adult. So it's in this context that you have a very elaborate immigration system set up to try to determine who was eligible for entry and who was not.
Yeah, Alan. Oh, wait for the mic, please.
Thank you. Alan Crowd, American University. I'm wondering, you've opened up such an interesting avenue of inquiry when you talk about middle class. And historians have done much less with the issue of class than perhaps we should, especially with respect to the immigrant experience. And I'm wondering if the definition of what it means to be middle class, what definition you had in mind, and whether or not the definition changes as you move from group to group to group, or is it from generation to generation? And you had a multi-generational study, so it makes it an even more compelling question.
Right. Thanks for that question. I did not use a very elaborate social scientific definition of middle class. It's more relational.
class, I would say. But I think I considered people middle class who were did not work with their hands, who would engage in some kind of mental labor or business, but also who did not own extensive property either. I mean, they might have owned a home or a small shop, but they didn't own, a factory, or they weren't manufacturers, or they weren't capitalists, right? So interestingly, one of the things I found was in 1903, when the Chinese reformer Liang Qichao came to the United States and toured the country, he did his own informal census of Chinese in America, and he found 500 interpreters, which I thought was a large number. It was more than double the number of Chinese herbalists, doctors, and ministers combined. And he described the interpreters as, he said, the men who work for the little law firms, the courts, the police, and the customs. At that time, immigration was run through the Customs Bureau. So that actually, said a lot to me in terms of, what kind of strategies actually were there for to become a middle class person. So the merchants in Chinatown, for the most part, also were middle class. But they, as I mentioned before, they operated within the ethnic enclave. So they were Chinese immigrant middle class, but they weren't Chinese American middle class. And I was interested in this process of becoming a Chinese American, kind of an ethnic middle class among both the first but also the second generation. And some of the people who the tapes lived in the tape circle that they knew, and certainly the men that the tape daughters married, often they were the children, American-born children of merchants, or sometimes workers in Chinatown.
Yes, over here.
Tino Calabi, also a Columbia grad. You mentioned that Tate v. Early was about 1885, right. Was it? So black segregated schools, though, went on for another 80 years before the Supreme Court overturned school segregation. In San Francisco, then, how long did the Chinese segregated school last, and what time did it take before Chinese and other Asians were able to enter the public school system without a segregated, separate but equal school?
I believe the Chinese primary school went as long as World War II. But I should clarify that it was not required that every Chinese child go to that school. Let me clarify. The Chinese could go to high school in San Francisco. The primary school went to the 8th grade. So after that, if Chinese in San Francisco wanted to continue to high school, they could go to a regular high school. So Robert Park, who married one of the tape daughters, went to Lowell High School, and then he actually went on to Berkeley and studied college for some years. The way the law was written in California was that a school district may establish a segregated school for Chinese if it wanted to. So it wasn't a requirement that all Chinese had to go to one. So, for example, when they moved to Berkeley, the tape children go to the Berkeley schools. But the Chinese laws on Chinese segregation in California basically do not fall until the World War II era. The land laws that prevented Asians, especially Japanese, from owning agricultural property, they fall after the war. So there's a general repeal of legal measures that were aimed to prevent Asian Americans.
Yes, please.
Francis Lee. Following up on your remark about the Chinese schools and the Asian exclusion of Asians from owning property, but so the school systems did not exclude or did not segregate Japanese, is that correct?
That's a famous case. Yes, yes. They did when the Japanese population began to accrete around the turn of the century in San Francisco. San Francisco School Board required Japanese children to go to the Chinese school, and they renamed it the Oriental Primary School. But the Japanese community was so angry about this that they used their diplomatic relations with the United States to protest this, and it caused a real diplomatic crisis where Roosevelt sent Root to California to try to negotiate a deal, and this controversy actually leads to the Gentleman's Agreement, where Japan agrees to voluntarily restrict the immigration of laborers to the United States in exchange for, one of the things it was in exchange for was that they wouldn't have to go to the Oriental School. But Franklin is the expert on this question. Do you want to add anything?
No, just that the difference was that Qing China, the Manchu dynasty, was relatively weak at the time, and the Japanese government and military was expanding pretty rapidly. So by 1904-05, the Japanese military had defeated China in the 1890s and then in Russia in 1904-05. So the United States had to pay attention to Japan, and while it could ignore China's diplomatic efforts on behalf of the diaspora.
Yes, please. In the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Roberta Chu. I'm with the Fairfax County Asian American History Project, which is in Northern Virginia. I found your presentation really interesting. I'm from San Francisco. Mm-hmm. I went to Spring Valley Elementary School in the 1950s, and I had no idea that it didn't used to allow Chinese kids. When I was there in the 1950s, I would say 95% of the population was Chinese kids, Chinese American kids. Now, my comments are only going to reflect what I've heard today because I haven't read your book yet. But what I get from what you're saying is that, or you're highlighting a very particular elite group, of obviously not that many people who were interpreters and such. And you differentiate them as forming the Chinese American middle class as opposed to the larger enclaves, the San Francisco Chinatowns, the Marysville Chinatown, Oroville Chinatown. But I guess I would say the larger middle class, the Chinese American middle class, did emanate from the Chinatowns. My maternal grandfather, came to the U.S. in the 1870s. He was running a business by the 1890s. He lived all his life in Chinatown, in the heart of Chinatown, Washington Street. He ran an herbal shop, even though he wasn't an herbalist. But I think a lot of it is he used, well, maybe it just came up, but he used the herbal shop to be able to bring in other immigrants because they would come on, they would pay $500, they would become partners in his business, and then he would go to the immigration station and vouch for them. And the Labor Department would require the updating of this list all the time. So every year he would seem to have whole new names, whole list of new investors in this business. But I got off track a little bit. But I just wanted to say that I really think that the Chinese American middle class, and you kind of defined it as more Chinese as opposed to Chinese American. But in fact, it was a Chinese culture, but it was a very Chinese American culture within San Francisco Chinatown. I mean, my mother and her sisters dressed just like they did. I mean, they looked very Western. They did all the same things. They went to the 1939 World's Fair. They got on, it just isn't just this group. And I guess I get the sense that you're kind of saying they defined Chinese American middle class, and I really think it came more out of the Chinatowns and then when they moved out to the suburbs.
Right. Well, thank you for that comment. I don't disagree with you, actually. I mean, I think a lot of them did come from Chinatown. As I mentioned, the daughters married boys whose parents were merchants or workers in Chinatown. I guess I want to say that they were the first, among the very first. Because they were able to use their roles as interpreters and brokers to actually leave Chinatown. And I found that as early as 1900, 1905, they have a social circle that's not based in Chinatown. A lot of it revolves around the Christian churches, the Chinese mission churches, None of the tapes were baptized. I mean, they were not religious. They didn't go to church on a regular basis, but their social circle was around the Chinese Mission Church in Oakland, and to an extent they still related to the mission churches in Chinatown, in San Francisco. And what I thought was interesting was they had a whole social network that seemed to be somewhat insular, separate from Chinatown, or somewhat apart, not completely separate, but somewhat apart, but also not fully included in white society. So as the kids got older and some of them started to go to college, then you see this network persist. So there was like Gertrude, the youngest daughter. Her husband was part of a group of Chinese Americans who went to Cal and Stanford, and they all had the same small social. I mean, there were only a handful of Asian Americans graduating from Cal in the first decade of the century. So I don't really disagree with you, but I want to say that these were the pioneers. These were the first generation that went to the suburbs, right? And later, many more would.
I just want to follow up on this for 1 second. Would this have represented upward mobility for them? I mean, what class would they have been in China?
In China, mostly they came from peasant or farming backgrounds, or kind of small scale. If they weren't farmers, their families had been peasants, and maybe they worked as a laborer in a small town. So yes, it would have been an upward step. I don't really know that much about Joseph and Mary's Chinese background. I mean, Mary appears to have been, swept into the indentured servant and prostitution trade somehow. So we can kind of guess at how that happened. Joseph came from Taishan, which is where 90% of the immigrants came in that period. And that was a small village and a county, and those people were all rural farmers. And he climbed up. I mean, he came, and his first job was as a house servant for a dairy farmer out on Van Ness Avenue, and then he started driving the milk wagon, and then he was actually one of the very first, if not the first, Chinese in San Francisco to have a horse and a wagon and to get into the work of teaming.
You just want to give other people a chance right here, yeah. This gentleman, yeah.
Excuse me. My name is Mermin Fu. I'm a writer of the China Times of Taiwan. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the language proficiency of these interpreters. For instance, from what I know, most of them, even as interpreters, spoke kind of a pidgin English. Also, I'd like to know, for instance, did they acquire the English language ability before coming to the States, or they learned to speak English while in the States? And also their Chinese language proficiency. And since you described this group of people as the middle class among the Chinese Americans, I wonder, you kind of alluded to this famous person, Liang Qichao. His mentor, Kang Youwei, was also in the United States. So I wonder, as sort of the elite kind of people among the Chinese, did they have much interaction with leaders from China, such as Liang Qichao, Kang Youwei, or even Sun Yat-sen, for that matter?
Thanks. Okay, those are two really great questions. The first interpreters in the 1850s were Chinese who learned English in Hong Kong or Guangzhou from the missionaries. Then there were actually whites who worked as Chinese interpreters in San Francisco, mostly from missionary families who had background in China. When the immigration first, after the exclusion law was passed and immigration first started to hire interpreters in San Francisco, they only hired white people because they didn't trust the Chinese. And it's only by the kind of turn of the century that you have a group of Chinese Americans who begin to work, are able to get jobs. In cities outside of San Francisco, the immigration hired Chinese earlier because there was no other people that around. You asked a really interesting question about their language proficiency. There are two kinds of interpreters around the early 20th century, late 19th century. One are the Chinese who come as immigrants who learn English after they get here. And they mostly learn them from mission schools. And their Chinese was good because they're from China, but their English was not very good. You're right, a lot of them spoke a kind of pidgin. They could barely speak English. But the need for translating was so great that even if you spoke English poorly, you still spoke more than somebody who spoke none, so you could be the interpreter, right? Then you have people like Frank Tape who come up who are Chinese American. They speak English, but their Chinese is not very good. Like all second generation, right? Their mother tongue is weak. So Frank spoke English fluently, but he spoke Cantonese very poorly, and he never was literate. There were some Chinese Americans who were well educated in English and Chinese. So Robert Park, who married Emily Tape, he was literate in Chinese. And he was the translator at the courthouse, but he also was editor of Chinese World newspaper. And he was a very interesting person because he was one of the founding members of Chinese American Citizens Alliance in San Francisco. But he also was an active member and at one time president of the Sanyi Huiguan, the district association for people from the Sanyi districts, which was the most powerful family district association in Chinatown in those days. And he was political. Most of the tapes actually did not seem to be very interested in China or any kind of politics at all. And Joseph and Mary, none of them actually ever went back to China, which I found curious. But Robert Park was much more engaged in politics, both Chinese politics and Chinatown politics. And he was one of the people who met with and represented Chinatown to the city after the earthquake, because they wanted to move Chinatown to a remote area, and he was one of the people who was engaged in arguing with the city officials. So you're right, the language. So the language proficiency seems either to have been was lopsided. Either you knew Chinese and not too much English, or you knew English and not too much Chinese. And there were rare cases where the person was truly bilingual. But I think they were actually the exception in the early part of the 20th century.
There's a question right there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Camille Caballo, and I'm a SOGI Fellow and intern at the Asian Pacific American Program. So my question may be out of your research scope / time scope, but I'll try it anyway. Curious, from cultural brokering, these different cultural brokers sort of influenced on immigrants' American cultural norms or social norms that allowed them to assimilate, right? Or at least seem like they're assimilating into American culture. First off, how do you think cultural brokers have evolved to today? Or is there an existence of cultural brokers? And secondly, how are the cultural norms and social norms from late 19th century, early 20th century different from that of today?
Small question.
Thank you. The culture brokers are a little different than the brokers that I study, because the culture brokers engage in political and cultural discussion or discourse where they represent what they think is the interest or the image of the community to the mainstream. And so my brokers, or the ones I study, are more quotidian brokers. They engage in these, business acts, right, everyday life. But sometimes they overlap, right? Sometimes the interpreters also serve as culture brokers. And I think there are differences between 100 years ago and today. But I think the culture brokers usually try to do two things, and which have remained the same. One is they try to give what they think is a more accurate or more just picture of Chinese culture or Asian cultures to the Americans. They try to combat stereotypes and try to portray or educate people about the culture of the homeland in a more positive light, right? And second, I think their aim is to say that despite different cultural background, that our people are capable of being Americans and are actually Americans, just like other Americans. So I think those are the two kinds. So one is about being Chinese, and one is about being American. And I think they try to translate those experiences to the mainstream. And I think to varying degrees of success, depending on a lot of other factors, in terms of the political climate and what's going on in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to add something to that? That's a great question.
Yeah, it is. It's a complicated question, I think. Yeah. So somebody should study that.
But you are a culture broker, right, at Smithsonian, right? That's
right.
Well, the part of my comments that my wife Enid made me take out was about how you felt about Colombia. But yeah, I think we are, in the sense that these are overwhelmingly, predominantly Eurocentric, European American institutions at the Smithsonian, where when I was directing your program, the political climate was supportive. The cultural climate was pretty much ignorant. So the need to convince people, my co-directors or the castle, one by one almost, was an overwhelming kind of task and very daunting. So it was trying to represent. I never found the way, by the way, of figuring out how to exploit my people and enrich myself.
You were looking for?
I could have used some. I could have used your book much earlier.
But isn't that always, when you think about the U.S. and the history of the composition of our population, it's always this, it's group after group after group. What insights do you see? This happened with the German Americans, it happened with Jewish Americans, Italians. What are there insights to be drawn from this experience for the Muslim populations today, do you think? Maybe that's kind of coming out of left field, but think about it while others. Go ahead.
Okay, let's have Alice answer that question.
I have no answer to that. Hang on a moment. I think, maybe one way of answering
Introduce yourself.
My name is Alice O'Connor. I'm a historian at UC Santa Barbara. But maybe one way of answering it is that, there are dangers in comparing, maybe too easily comparing immigrant experiences. But actually, my question had a little bit more to do with the difference between, say, bringing a case, bringing a civil rights case, and whether you see that as a form of brokering versus, in which case, of course, the family is acting as advocates for themselves, but probably in alliance with other people who have access to the American legal system, versus the kind of brokering they were doing, as you describe it, on a more day-to-day, daily basis. And if you can talk about the difference.
Okay. Let me hazard an answer to Sonia's question. I wouldn't deign to tell the Muslims in America what to do, but I do think that I think one of the insights that I came to with this research is that when there is a tremendous amount of prejudice and obstacles, it's actually it is very hard to overcome. And I think that what we have to give up is this myth that eventually it all works out okay. That eventually, that every group goes from being excluded to becoming included. I don't think there's any guarantees at all, and if we thought there were, then we really wouldn't be historians, because historians don't think anything is preordained, right? So I think the fact that different groups over time have overcome obstacles and become included has to be explained specifically and historically
for that group.
For that group. And for the Chinese, there really wasn't any other way to get ahead at this time other than through this very narrow window. Or for a lot of groups through, kind of quasi-legal means, because you couldn't make money through legitimate channels. So people made money, by smuggling in people or selling drugs or opium or whatever. And I think, the great generation of World War II, the Euro-American ethnics who became assimilated in the decades after World War II, I think we can attribute that to a number of things that have to do with the conditions of the time, right? A growing liberal political atmosphere, a coming of a generation politically in the 50s and 60s that had clout in the urban Democratic Party, an expanding economy where there was not only more wealth but also declining inequalities of wealth, a very generous welfare state with a GI Bill that enabled the children of immigrants to buy houses and go to college. I mean, there are a lot of conditions that enabled them to press for their inclusion. And those conditions don't exist today, right? So I think there's a combination of the efforts made by each group, but also economic and political and demographic conditions that enable people to make moves at different times. So I think that's why, I don't know what will happen so much with Muslims, but with Latinos today, you can see the changing demographics, and you can see, the states that turned from, is it red to blue or blue to red? I never remember which color is which party. But the states that actually changed from the last Bush election to Obama's were states with large Hispanic populations, right? Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Florida. You just look at the map, and that tells you something. So I think that it's a very complicated question that really actually has to be understood in its specificities.
I would, and I think maybe they're not decisive, but in our early studies of when we were first looking at, okay, who's actually written about Asians in America? Many of the studies were done by people who were white Americans and who had a paternalistic view of trying to help these poor, benighted heathen. So we tended to not use those so much and move into our own explorations of working class history and so on. But one of the things I do think you're helping us to do is go back and say and actually take a look at the majority or elite populations and how they help struggling people, so that there are really good folks who work against the grain in supporting minority groups, and right. Probably those are important individuals and organizations to look for and to applaud for the kinds of things that they do to help their neighbors.
Do you want to go 1 second? Do you want to go back to Alice's question?
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think bringing the lawsuit in itself was an act of brokering. I think it's something that they as brokers did, and I think it was one part of what I saw as this paradox of both, because of their in-between position, that they could both protest exclusion, but they could also profit from exclusion. So they straddled the line, and so therefore they could go both ways, and they did go both ways.
Could you say more about that case? It seems like to bring a civil rights case, the community has to be somewhat mobilized to get to that stage. Is that true in this case?
Well, yeah. Actually, the Chinese were really good at using the federal courts to press for civil rights, in part because they didn't have the vote. But the courts, but they could go to court, and they were extremely organized. There are actually many much more famous cases than Tate v. Hurley, heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, are Chinese cases. And probably the most famous that has implications beyond Chinese is Yiguo v. Hopkins, right, which establishes that the 14th Amendment applies to all persons, not just citizens, and expanded the scope of the 14th Amendment beyond political rights to substantive economic rights. But the Chinese cases were the Chinese had, the Chinese 6 companies, which was the alliance of the family associations, and the Chinese consul acted as a kind of NAACP in those days. They brought test cases. Whenever there was a bad law passed, they found somebody to challenge it, and they paid for the legal fees. In Tape v. Hurley, Joseph Tape went to the Chinese consul where he knew people because he had sometimes interpreted for them. And the first person they sent to talk to the school board was the vice consul, who was actually a white guy, interestingly, Frederick B. So they were organized, and almost all of the civil rights cases were brought as test cases, sponsored by their family associations. And the lawyer for the consul was William Gibson, who was the son of Otis Gibson, who was a famous Methodist missionary in Chinatown.
Yes, you had another question.
I'd like to extend the discussion of the last 10 minutes and turn it around a little bit by referring to your earlier book with the intriguing subtitle of Illegal Immigrants and the Making of Modern America. You did refer a little bit just now in this discussion to how Hispanics perhaps have changed America a little bit. And I'd like to know, since I presume your earlier book, The Making, just illegal immigrants in general, referred to several types of illegal locations that immigrants came from. How do the Chinese immigrants that you're talking about in the current book help to broaden, extend, move into the future modern America, and how does it compare with what previous immigrant groups from other parts of the world had accomplished? It's both your books.
Well, actually, I mean, there is a direct connection between the two books because it was the allegations that members of the family were engaged in smuggling of illegal aliens that got me interested in the case, right? But it was this contrast with how, first I thought, well, maybe Frank Tape was just a bad egg, right? You have this kind of eminent civil rights family, and then they have, the wayward son. So I had to be careful. I had to think about, well, was there actually a more analytical explanation going on there? And that's where, after thinking about it for a long time, I thought that their position as brokers is what could explain them being on both sides of the line, so to speak. I'm not sure if I'm really getting to...
Actually, I'm asking you about something bigger than that. I'm asking you about how immigration, and now legal immigration from China, is moving the whole American cultural, political, and so forth scene. Because when you talk about the making of modern America, that's not static. It's not just assimilating and acculturating the immigrants. It's talking about how America itself changes. And I don't mean necessarily this particular family that you focused on.
Right, okay. No, thank you. Well, I think as long as there continues to be large streams of undocumented immigrants, it creates a situation both in the communities of those immigrants and for a larger society where you have a group that is kind of like a social caste, right? They, as the policy people say, they live in the shadows, right? And it's a drag on everything for all of us. So I think that general problem continues to persist, and one could say it's an even bigger problem today than it was 100 years ago because the numbers are so much greater. But I think, one of the things that was said at the immigration conference we had here last October was that this condition of a certain group of immigrants being highly racialized and kind of isolated in the lower strata of the labor force, right, and excluded from political participation, right, by dint of their unauthorized status. Dave Gutierrez says, well, maybe that's the new normal, that we've always had immigrants occupying that position in society, actually regardless of their legal status, right, and now the problem of undocumented status is even greater. But at the turn of the century, for many European immigrants, they were in the same condition, right? excluded from the primary labor market, culturally isolated, objects of nativist opposition, racism, the whole 9 yards. And as I was saying, their long path towards inclusion was something that had to involve a whole lot of historical factors, not just their own efforts, right? But their own efforts could only succeed in a larger context.
So the fact that they're Chinese is no different from being Hispanic or...
Well, I think each group has its own particularities, right? Each group has its own particularities, I think, yes.
I mean, I think what the question sort of points to, there's a whole series of books about how the Irish became white, how the Jews became white, how these different groups became white. And I think what this question suggests is not that everybody became white, but that whiteness changed, or that what constituted mainstream America changed. So I think, do you think did the Chinese become white, or did America become more Chinese? I guess it might be one way of thinking about it.
You know what? One of the things that strikes me with the current dialogue about undocumented folks and illegals and all of this is the strident concerns about the 14th Amendment. And as May pointed out, I mean, the Equal v. Hopkins thing was, case was extremely important to make sure that the courts ruled that the Constitution applies to all persons in the United States, and that's something that's under fire today. And the other one was Wong Kim Ark, 1898, which we thought definitively settled the issue of citizenship being conferred upon people being born in the United States. And that's something now that's being discussed in Congress and across the country, that if kids are born here to undocumented aliens, that they should not inherit or legitimately bear the citizenship status. So, I mean, those things are, I think, actually, things that the Chinese contributed in terms of, deepening this our understanding of what the Constitution should mean.
I do think, though, that for Asian Americans, that there is there's not as much racism as there was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. I think there's more acceptance in certain circles. I think in part because you have a larger professional class. And the fact that we have so many professional or middle class Asian Americans is actually it's a product of the 1965 immigration law, which favored the immigration of professionals. Right, so it's kind of a selective immigration stream that began a kind of disproportionate number of professionally trained Asian immigrants in the latter part of the 20th century. I mean, people think, well, all the Chinese are doctors and, whatever, Well, not every. You think everybody in China is a doctor? I mean, or India. You think everybody in India is a doctor? No, it's just a certain selection of the immigration stream that favors that strata of people, and then once they come, they bring their relatives, and then you have a kind of chain migration that reproduces that class composition. So I think it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of curious to me that people think that all Asians are, scientists. Well, if anybody goes to China, you would know that not all Chinese are scientists. So so there's something about the way the law operates. But I think because you have a larger middle class and educated group here, I think there is more acceptance. There are still issues. I mean, you still can only go so far up a corporate ladder if you're a Chinese American. And actually now you have an interesting reverse migration of well-educated, professional Chinese Americans going to China to do business, because that's really where the action is in the global economy. And if you can speak Chinese, you can be a culture broker going that way, right?
Yeah.
Well, we have to end the discussion here, but we thank you, our guests, very, very much for this wonderful discussion, and thank you, audience, for your great questions, too. Thank you so much. Okay, now don't go away, because we can continue, but we just had to say that for the videotape. So here, this gentleman has a question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Bob Wells. I'm writer and a sea captain. Also grew up in Southern California, went to UCLA, and have a great interest in U.S. maritime history in particular, with a focus on the Trans-Pacific steam transport, including Chinese steerage passengers, and San Francisco maritime history. But my question is, just looking at your book, it really looks good, and I really appreciate the contribution to not only American history but also California history that the lucky ones will have. But how old do you think Mary McGladrey was, and how did she get from Hong Kong to San Francisco?
Could I just piggyback a question on that? The view that we often have of these missionaries who rescued women was that, young girls, was that they were performing social control, that they were trying to assimilate them sort of rudely into American culture. So from what you know about Mary, how would you judge her experience?
I'm happy to that there's a maritime historian here, somebody interested in sailing. I'm a novice sailor myself, so I have an interest in ships and boats too. Mary told people later that she was around 11 when she came. So based on her age, she came in 1868. And 1868 was just a little bit after the transition went from sail to steam. Now, there are no passenger manifests from that era. The San Francisco Chronicle every day had a column called Shipping Intelligence, and it would announce the arrival of every ship into harbor. And it would tell you, and they would list the names of the white passengers, and then it would say 80 or 800 Chinamen, right, unnamed. I looked at every ship, report of every ship that arrived in 1868 and 1869 to see if I could find any clues as to which ship she came on. That was hard because I didn't know her Chinese name, and even if I had, it wouldn't have been listed, right? This might answer part of Franklin's question about the conjecture that I engage in the book, and the perhaps and maybes and possibilities. So I don't know for sure exactly on what ship she came, but I think she might have come on the Colorado because it had in the list of Euro-American passengers, it listed it listed one white family with a Chinese servant, unnamed, and actually a Chinese family with a servant, right? So it wasn't that they didn't mention any Chinese, but you had to be in cabin class, right? So I thought, well, maybe she was brought as a servant. Maybe she came in with one of those two parties. But the ship also had, several hundred, I don't remember the exact number, of unnamed Chinese, including 80 women, or not 80, but including a number of women. And there are newspaper reports about the time of the ship's arrival, because what was happening in that period and how she ends up in the lady's home is that because of the scandals around prostitution and the problem of prostitution, what was happening was that the leaders in Chinatown from the district associations would actually go to the docks, and they would actually take all the women off the ship and take them to a hall. And then they would question them, and those who were bona fide wives, who had husbands that they could identify and they knew, they would deliver those women to their husbands. And the rest they assumed were brought in for prostitution, and they gave them to the sheriff and remanded them to the sheriff to put on the next outbound steamer. But then what happened was that the brothel owners or the procurers got wise to this, so they would bring a habeas corpus suit on behalf of the women, and then they would go in court. And the women, none of the women would admit that they were prostitutes. They would say, well, no, that's my husband over there. And the judge would have to let them go because they had no way of proving otherwise. But the judge would not release young girls. And Mary, if we understand her story, was about 11. So there was a story about 2 girls taken off that ship who were remanded to the custody of the sheriff. Then somehow she ends up brought to the home by this minister. So I conjecture that either she gets to the brothel and she runs away, or the sheriff delivers her to the minister. Somehow she gets delivered to the minister and she's taken to this home. And at this time, the rescue was not a public project, right? It was, and I, she was either the very first one or one of the very first ones to be rescued in that way. Later, it becomes a project where I think, it's true the missionaries themselves had their own agenda for civilizing these Chinese slave girls and slave women. But the Chinese women themselves often wanted to get out of the brothels. Oftentimes a raid would take place when a woman who was in a prostitute actually had a lover, and the lover wanted to get her out and marry her. But there was no way. I mean, you could kind of buy somebody out, but that took a lot of money. So they would go to the missionaries. The missionaries would stage a raid with the police, get the girl out, then put her in the home, and then this is where the two interests coincide, and then they would keep her there for 6 months and make the man, the lover, pay her board as a indication of his good intentions. And then in those 6 months, she would be trained in, to read the Bible and to learn, how to be a proper wife. And then they would get married, and then there'd be a big article in the paper about, another Christian marriage. But Mary's was as a young girl, and there were also young girls who were rescued, who were not actually prostitutes, but indentured servants. So that's all in the book.
Okay, on that note, I think we do need to really conclude. This is the real conclusion, but I think that our speakers will be around for a little bit longer. You can sign some books, which I think are still for sale outside. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for participating.
Thank you very